afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to today's Snow Speaker Series. My name is Laura Pimentel. I'm the Director of Development here at ProLiteracy, and we're so glad to have all of you here live, as well as our streamed audience online. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I especially want to thank the John Ben Snow Memorial Trust for funding this entire speaker series. We're really grateful to them. I will do a couple of housekeeping items and then introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into today's session. A few things. So we are streaming this live online. So for all of our live studio audience members, please silence your cell phones. Keep it quiet in the room so that we don't interrupt the stream for our audience online. And if you do get up, be conscious that there's cameras around, so please just duck around. But feel free to get up if you do have to. Secondly, we have surveys. We'd love to hear your feedback about today's session. So for those in the audience, you have a paper survey in front of you. Please don't forget to fill that out and leave it for us today. For our online members, we do have an email coming to you at the end of today, so we'd love for you to fill that out. Want to hear all of your feedback. Now to introduce our panelists, we have Todd Evans and Marcia Tate. Marcia Tate is the Executive Director of Literacy CNY. And she has a wide-ranging background in nonprofit and for-profit organizations focusing on public policy, advocacy, fund development, meeting facilitation, event planning. She has provided adult learners across Central New York with the literacy tools and skills they need to be productive and engaged members of the community. Thank you, Marcia, for being here. And Todd Evans is a project manager here at ProLiteracy. He's been with us for over 21 years. His experience includes intra and interdepartmental technology project support, adult literacy-related technology research, English language learning, and distance education training. He also trains local programs on how to use technology for instruction, administration, volunteer training, and promotion. So thank you both, Todd, for being here as well. I'm going to turn it over to them now to start our series on volunteer recruitment and retention.
Do this without spilling coffee there. Thank you all for coming, and we'll just go ahead and get started. So today we're talking about volunteer recruitment and retention, and even though our experience is mostly in the literacy field, I think a lot of the things we're going to talk about are going to be relevant for anyone that uses volunteers as part of their service delivery. So the first thing I wanted to talk about, Marcia, is, and we have, I have charts. I have there was a study that I was reading that talked about the top reasons why people do not volunteer with different organizations. And this is not just a literacy study, but it was across a wide range of organizations that use volunteers. And the top 4 reasons were: I don't have any extra time. They were unwilling to make a year-round commitment. They gave money instead of time. And obviously, I think any of you that work in a nonprofit you appreciate the money, but we would like to have both money and time, right? And then the last one was no one had personally asked them. And to start the discussion off, I want to talk about those first 2 items, no time and the year commitment. I know in the literacy field, we tend to ask people, especially those who are doing volunteer tutoring, for a year commitment to work with a student, meet with that student 2 times a week for a year. And that seems to be a barrier for a lot of folks to come and participate as volunteers in our organizations. And it seems like a very, not artificial, but self-imposed barrier. And Marcia, I know your Literacy CNY has started doing some things to try to break down some of those barriers. Would you talk about that?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, we had found that to be our experience as well, particularly in the one-to-one volunteering program, that was a really big commitment to ask people to do. And we have a 15-hour training, as a lot of literacy programs do, and then a requirement that the one-to-one tutors commit to 50 weeks out of the year for 2 hours a week. And we did find that was really a barrier to folks saying that commitment is just too big. I can't do that. So several years ago, we started to intentionally diversify our instructional volunteer opportunities. And we do, of course, still have the one-to-one volunteer program. And those of you in the room know that Ruth Colvin, our founder, is still on my board. So I will never, ever not have a one-to-one volunteer tutoring program. But in addition, we started to look at things like, could we train volunteers to work in classroom settings around the community? And we negotiated a partnership with our city school district and our BOCES, which is a statewide type of program here in New York, where we actually train and support volunteers to go into their classrooms and provide supplemental tutoring for their low-level students who are struggling in their classrooms. And we also started to put trained volunteers into some of our own small group classrooms. And then we decided that we had a need among our English language learners, which was identified by our instructors, for oral English practice, not just the grammar and the structure and the language that they were learning in class, but actually oral English practice. So we developed a program to train volunteers to lead conversation groups with the English language learners. And the result of that is that we've really diversified those opportunities for the instructional volunteers, and I think that helps.
Yeah, I think, so tell a little bit about, if I remember correctly, some of those opportunities you're actually team teaching as well, like the classrooms, there's a paid instructor, and then the volunteer is supporting that
Yes.
teacher, and then in the conversations, it's more than one
Yes.
instructor. So we had a similar experience in Memphis when we started doing our classroom instruction, and we started looking at those classroom volunteer teaching opportunities not as being fulfilled by one person, but being fulfilled by a team of people.
Yes.
And what it, like kind of like what you said, what it allowed people to do is take breaks and then be able to come back. And we wound up having folks that probably wouldn't have ever volunteered with us who are now volunteers with us for 3 or 4 or 5 years.
Right, and if I could take that even a little bit further, as you know, ProLiteracy is headquartered in Syracuse, which is where my program is. And so we have a large number of people that we call snowbirds who leave for the winter. And, you know, if they're being trained and going into the one-to-one tutoring relationship, you can't just stop because you're going to Florida, because the student is going to take that very personally, and it interrupts the instruction. But those snowbirds are great candidates for our classroom program because they are working at the direction of a paid instructor, whether it's our paid instructor or a school district paid instructor. So there's no lesson planning, which is a big challenge for our volunteers, as you know. And if they do leave for the winter or for vacation or they're whatever, you know, they're sick, it does not interrupt the instruction. Instruction goes on. And so that has turned out to be a nice thing that we did that. And then to go back to your question about the conversation groups, yes, we do that in pairs. So there's 2 volunteers working together in those conversation groups and coming up with the ideas and facilitating the discussion with the students. And I think when we talked about this, I was telling you that they, as a group, all those conversation group leaders email the entire group after each session that they do, and they talk about what ideas they came up with, where the conversation went, and they would kind of report back on some of the things the students talked about. On the staff, we all get copied on these as well, and they're fascinating reading because you never really know where that conversation is going to go. And I think that's really an example of where the volunteers are getting a tremendous amount out of that experience because they're learning about other cultures and food and customs and all kinds of things. Just read a report this week, for example, from 2 conversation group leaders where they got talking about Father's Day coming up this weekend. And some of the students from other countries wanted to know why people buy fathers' tools and toolboxes on Father's Day. They thought that was really an odd custom. And it turned out that in many of their home countries, they actually celebrate mother, father, and grandparents all on the same day. It's a very different kind of tradition. It was fascinating to read, and I think, again, very enriching for the volunteers as well as the students.
Hallmark must not have gotten into those countries yet.
That's right.
No, but I think so. I think that's a good model for one way of looking at overcoming those barriers is thinking about using a team of people to meet those volunteer needs as opposed to just one individual. And it takes the pressure off kind of the day-to-day thing and allows people an opportunity to volunteer, get a meaningful volunteer experience, and still be able to carry on with other aspects of their life. Now, I think you had also talked about, we had talked about previously, that was leading you to start thinking about how you recruited people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So in our program, we have, as I said, the traditional one-to-one volunteer and student pair program, but a few years ago we started to also, through grant funding, support small group classrooms. And in those classrooms, I have paid instructors, and those are paid for through grants, but they're kept very small still, so that we're still true to our pedagogy of, student-centered instruction and so forth. And in the last year, what we have done with this is all of the tutors still go through that 15-hour training we were talking about earlier. And I've realized that just like it's probably a different student profile for the person who would want to be in the one-to-one pair from the person who would want to be in the classroom setting, because their goals may be different. The same is probably true of our volunteers. So we've begun to think about how do we target the recruitment of the volunteers a little bit differently so that those who are going to become one-to-one, they may know that already, that that's really what they want to do. And others who maybe wouldn't consider the one-to-one because they know the time commitment and what's involved might be more attracted to it if they knew there was this supplemental classroom opportunity or the conversation group opportunity. So in the coming program year, we're going to begin to really do that a little bit differently.
Right. I think it opens you up to maybe tapping into some audiences that you wouldn't ordinarily tap into, college students who might be gone for the summer, as you said before, snowbirds, folks like that, folks who have like a changing work schedule, that sort of thing. But I think it also, the situations that you were describing remind me of another study, and I have another chart here. I like charts, about why people volunteer. And when I was looking at this and thinking about our literacy programs, we focus, or I think our field, focuses a lot on using volunteers for instruction, which is our primary mission. And so I think from our own organizational data that we collect from our member organizations, instructional volunteers wind up being over about 75% of the volunteers used in the program. And so we are very good when we're developing our recruiting messages, talking about those first issues about commitment to the cause. We also talk a lot about how volunteering to teach somebody to read and seeing the progress that person makes is a very rewarding experience for you. But I don't think we do a very good job of marketing towards those other reasons why people might volunteer, to meet people, to develop a skill set that would further their career, to get their foot in the door on something, or even just to, because they have a hectic work life or whatever and are looking for a way to volunteer to kind of escape from those things. And I suspect that kind of emphasis on marketing messaging around your particular mission might not just be limited to the literacy field. So I know your program is actually starting to take advantage of using volunteers for some of those other kind of skill sets and tapping into those other reasons why people might volunteer for social reasons like being able to team teach or developing skill sets and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about, I think it started with your board, right?
Right, yeah. So when we were thinking about how to diversify the volunteer opportunities, we also identified that volunteers can provide a tremendous resource for technical experience that, you know, if you have a very small staff, which we do, there are 3.5 of us on staff, you know, I can't afford a marketing person and a graphic artist and lawyers and accountants and, you know, the list goes on. And yet, as a nonprofit incorporated in New York, we have to perform all of those functions. So we've begun to, and really actually I've been doing this for several years now, using our board committees as a place where we can recruit and place people who have those kinds of professional experience. And two things can happen. One, I mean, they might just like being the graphic artist for the organization. We do have a graphic artist on our marketing and communications committee. Or it may turn out that they get really excited and passionate about the mission and they want to then later on be considered for the board. So it's sort of creating a pathway or a feeder system for the board. And I think we talked about a story that I'll tell now if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
This particular committee, our Marketing and Communications Committee, is mostly made up of very young professional people in that field. And so they have lots of ideas for use of technology, right? I'm getting old, so my kind of reaction to some of this is, oh, great, who's going to do that? You know, so what happened was our chair of that committee suggested that we should be doing at least quarterly, but even maybe more frequent e-blast to everyone we had an email address for. And so I had that doe in the headlights look. And then she said, and, you know, we could do videos. And I'm thinking, oh, great, I don't even own a video camera. But it turned out she had recruited a young professional person to that committee who has a friend who's a videographer. And they came in and they did this beautiful, really beautiful video in connection with our last mail appeal that went out in April. And I think you have or will have the link to look at that video. This was professionally filmed and edited. And there was a small script, which I wrote, and then it turned out we got 2 students involved, and they sort of ad-libbed some wonderful things about the agency that you would never have thought to script it. And so we ended up with this beautiful little video. And that's an example, I think, of using professional expertise in a way that we wouldn't have dreamed of, to be able to do something that you'd love to be able to do, but you never have the budget to do. There's also an example I think you have of another video that one of our board members, who also has some background in videography, came to our annual fundraiser 2 years ago, which for those of you who are local know it as Scrabble Mania. And he took a lot of footage and then he edited down this, again, wonderful video that we've been using as a promotional piece to give people an idea of what the event is like if you've never been there. So I think those are great examples of non-instructional opportunities.
Right, and to go out, to follow up on that, to go out and find those folks, it's a very different message.
Yes.
That you use to recruit those folks. When I do a workshop for volunteer literacy programs, one of the thought experiments I like to do with them is start by saying, imagine you had an unlimited budget, unlimited set of money. I want you to just write down a list of staff job duties that you would hire for your organization. And they tend to be exactly what you're talking about, all of those non-mission oriented things. I would hire a marketing director, a videographer, maybe 2 or 3 of them. I'd hire somebody to just take care of our website, our social media, Facebook, and things like that. Then I asked them to look at those staff that they would hire and think, are there any of those job duties that couldn't be done by a volunteer?
Right.
Typically, there aren't. All of those you can find volunteers, and it really helps people start to reimagine how they think about using volunteers, not just to deliver services, but really as a key component of their administrative staff for their organization.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think about those kinds of functions, lawyers, typically lawyers and law firms have to do a certain amount of community service. Law firms like to be seen as members of their community. So, and I do recognize some people would see this as a nightmare, but I have 3 lawyers on our board, and I love them because I can't keep up with all the changes in federal and state law. And when I have a question, I've got people to call. I don't have to pay $500 an hour for good legal advice.
Exactly.
So that's another example. But something you said triggered another thought, Todd, and that is this exercise you do for thinking about within your program, how could you use volunteers to do things you don't have the resources to do, is also a great thing to do with, for example, your local school district adult ed program, is to ask them that question. What things would you be doing in your classrooms if you had a free resource to do it with that your teachers can't get to? And it turns out that there are all kinds of things they would love to do, not just the supplemental tutoring, but classroom greeters and attendance takers and hospitality, all kinds of things. I think it's the Minnesota Literacy Council has a whole group of resources on their website about that, how to work in partnership with your schools in your community, the publicly funded part of our field, and get them thinking about how they would use volunteers. And by the way, they can usually find some money to pay for these things. So the volunteers that I have in our school district and our BOCES programs, they pay me to train and support those volunteers. So that can be a supplemental fund development activity for you as well.
Right. So those other volunteers wind up being an entry point into collaborations and relationships with other organizations. And then also perhaps an opportunity to make some extra money for your organization as well. That's fantastic.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to talk about, so this is kind of long-term volunteer use, but I know you talked about your Scrabble Mania, and I know you also have kind of very targeted volunteer use for that. Can you talk about that group of folks?
Sure, some of them are in this room today. We do. It's a very big event in this community. Our biggest year, we had 450 attendees, which is crazy for Syracuse. That's almost unheard of. And it requires a lot of volunteers. There are many tasks that need to be performed at that event. And we have sheriffs, and we have judges, and we have raffle ticket sellers, and and the list just goes on. And so we have 55 volunteers who are almost 30, I believe I counted 33 of them this year, only do Scrabble Mania. They are not instructional volunteers or any other kind of volunteer, but they come back every year for that event because that's what they want to do. And I think the beauty of that, there's a couple of things that are really important about that. As you pointed out when we were talking about those folks are ambassadors for our organization and our event. You know, we don't spend a lot of time at the event talking about instruction, but people do get a general idea of what we do in this community, and those event volunteers can go out and talk about that. They certainly talk up the event, and so they frequently are the catalyst for new people coming to the event because they've heard about it from somebody who volunteers there. So that has turned out to be a wonderful thing. And just a quick kind of side observation, in this community there are a number of events where The agency requires the event volunteer to buy a ticket to come, and they're really looking at that very narrowly as a revenue generating thing. You know, they've got a revenue goal. We don't ask our event volunteers to buy tickets because, you know, we want them to have a great time, and they work throughout the event, but they get to take, you know, they have dinner and they can do everything except play. And I think I told you, I had one judge one year who wanted to play on her round off. And I said, no, you're a judge. You can't go out there and play. That's a competitive advantage that is not fair. But other than that, they get to partake of everything else in the event. And I think that's one of the reasons it's become such a popular volunteer opportunity for us.
Right, right. And I think kind of going back to one of the initial points of that notion that people don't volunteer because they don't have the time, they can't make the year commitment. In a lot of those alternative volunteer opportunities that you've talked about, you've also mentioned how long those volunteers have been associated with your organization. So that barrier of not having the time to dedicate or not wanting to give a year commitment, it seems to me if your organization can rethink some of those volunteer opportunities and how they're structured, people find out that they have a lot more time than what they thought they did, and that they're willing to commit to your organization for a longer period of time. As you said, they are then, no matter how they're connected to your organization, they're an ambassador for your organization. They're going out and talking about the wonderful time they've had. And as we saw on that first chart, go back, the number 4 reason why people don't volunteer is that nobody asks. So if you have all of these ambassadors out there talking about your organization, what a great time they're having with your organization, that does a lot for your volunteer recruitment.
Absolutely, and we haven't gotten here yet, but we've also talked about the different vehicles at your disposal to use to recruit people like this, right? So again, you know, Ruth Colvin, our founder, lives in this community and ends up in the news frequently or ends up doing public speaking, and then whenever she does that, I get people calling wanting to become the one-to-one volunteer that she started to be a part of her program. But the other kinds of volunteers, you know, we use our website, posted on our website. I have a blurb about, and if you are, you know, if you have professional technical expertise to lend, we're always looking for committee members, board members, you know, call me to talk about that. And our committee chairs have become recruitment agents for getting people, non-board member participants, onto their committees. That's another thing. And we're very active with social media, at least with Facebook and to a somewhat lesser degree Twitter, but that's another, you know, so we're constantly sort of talking about all of these opportunities using those other vehicles as well.
Right, right. And I think one of the things when you're talking about using your website and using Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all of those other social media platforms, one of the things I heard somebody saying, it really resonated with me, is that you should spend maybe about 20% of your effort in those areas asking people to volunteer or, you know, donate money, things like that. And the other 80%, kind of a combination of information and education and just showing people what fun it is to be connected to your organization. And when you think about that, going back to that piece about, we've also found from our annual member reports that the number one way that people get volunteers into their organization is that they're recruited by their friends or family members. And this study that I identified said very much the same thing. People volunteer because they're asked by someone else. And I think that's really a good way to think about those social network platforms is if you're connected to a volunteer and you're showing that volunteer having a great time, that shows up on their Facebook page, and then everybody that's in their network gets to see how much fun that person is having as well.
Right.
And it kind of piques their interest.
Right, absolutely. And so what happens at Scrabble Mania is that the teams who play, typically are posting to Facebook or Twitter, whatever they do, all night long. And I never even see some of this stuff, but I know it's out there. So that's a recruitment vehicle not only for new volunteers, but also for more participants to the event.
Right.
It's like a free media campaign,
Right.
So yeah, I think that you really need to, that's a really good point about showing people how much fun they can have. And when we think about that traditional ask of, okay, so you'd like to volunteer with us, so you're going to sit through 15 hours of training over the next 5 weeks, and then we're going to ask you to sit alone in the corner of the local library with your student for 50 weeks out of the coming year. And so that person who's looking to meet other people, you have absolutely not hit it with that ask.
Right.
The person who wants to do that is a very different person than the person who comes to our Scrabble Mania event and wants to be a sheriff and literally wear a sheriff badge and a vest that says "Obey me" and walk around and tell people what to do. It's a very different volunteer. And the judge is a different volunteer from that, because that's somebody who wants to score boards in a quiet room and, on another floor. And so we talked about, I think the day we talked about this, that they have sort of self-selected at the event into the category that they like best. And when we call them for the next year, they typically tell us which job they'd like to have. It's pretty fun to watch.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to the second half of this presentation title, which was about volunteer retention. And I think there's less of a mystery around that. Volunteer retention, it seems to me, is really about understanding what it is someone is looking for, first of all, one of those 6 things or 7 things, and then making sure that the opportunity that you match them with meets that need. And if you do that and kind of check in with that person, they'll wind up, like you said, volunteering for your Scrabble Mania for 4 or 5 years in a row. And that's the only thing they do, but they are there long term.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that understanding the motivations is really important. And I think, we all know too that there are some limitations with volunteers. Sometimes they really aren't a good fit for a one-to-one volunteer student match, and you find out that, ooh, this is not, and you have to sit down and talk to them about why that isn't working. And I would also say, to be completely honest about the young professional that I described earlier, right on our marketing and communications committee. For example, those young professionals often are at the peak of their career. They're right in their 30s, and they have this very hot technical expertise, and so their jobs are very demanding. They may have young children at home, and so you have to recognize that if that's going to be your marketing and communications department, that you are going to have to find ways to gently manage them to adhere to schedules and deadlines and timelines. And that is time consuming, which is really where I'm going with the point, is that volunteer management is time consuming. It takes some time and some effort to do this well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think those types of volunteers need to be supported. I think that also comes back to maybe having that team approach as opposed to the individual person approach. You can recruit 3 or 4 people to be your marketing person, and you wind up getting one whole marketing person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we have. 5 people. Graphics, editorial, 2 videographers, and so forth. So yeah, that's exactly what you do.
Yeah, great. So I think that's kind of all the stuff that we had outlined to talk about. Anything else that you want to?
Yeah, I think a couple of other points. Thank them, and then thank them again. And when you are featuring, you're doing your e-blast or your newsletter, whatever you do, make sure you highlight some of your volunteer stories and thank them. So that's really key to this whole thing, is showing your appreciation for the resource. And for those who may not know this, a lot of grant applications will allow you to talk about the value of the volunteer time that is donated, and you can leverage the dollars that your funders are donating by saying we had X number of hundred of volunteer hours last year, and at the independent sector rate for my state, that equates to an in-kind contribution of X. I even know of some literacy programs, and we haven't been doing this, but I think we will in the future. You can actually show that on your financial statement as an in-kind gift and an in-kind expense, because it shows people that you have more resources. And there's nothing phony or illegal or fraudulent about doing that as long as you show the revenue and the expense. But it is an instructional asset and an instructional expense you have. So, those are just some thoughts that crossed my mind as I was sitting here.
No, I think both of those are good. I think that piece of recognition, you can't overthink someone. You can't over-recognize them for their contribution. And to me, it really is the kind of other bookend of that personal ask piece. I volunteer because really someone has asked me and said, I really need your help. And then when you help out, it's nice to be thanked for that, help that you gave.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And as you know, we're leaving here and going to my student and volunteer recognition reception today.
Yes, we
to
are.
do exactly that, and thank them and recognize them.
Right. And then the other thing I was going to say was, what was the other point that you...
About the financial side of this, the grants.
Right, the grants. Back to the thought experiment that I was talking about recruiting administrative volunteers. That whole thought experiment started because I was having a conversation with a colleague in St. Louis, and we were talking about the need that she had to get better data about the clients that she was serving, and people weren't turning in her reports, and I suggested she get volunteers to call those folks and get that data in. And she said, well, I can't use those kind of administrative volunteers because none of my grants allow me to write that into the grant. I can't pay for those volunteers. And I said, my usual way, I said, well, I think you're thinking about this all wrong. If I were in your shoes, I would come at it from the point of, not can I get a grant to pay for them, but would it be helpful to have someone get that data for me? Would that data allow me to get more grants? And if it is helpful and beneficial, then it would be great if they were paid for, but they're going to be valuable to you even if they're not being paid for by a grant. And so I think one other thing that we let happen is we let our volunteer opportunities be narrowed by that focus on the mission and also the focus on what can be paid for by grants and our different funding streams. And we need to be sure that we think not just in terms of what can be paid for, but what is useful and valuable to us.
And I'm glad you reminded me of this, because we also talked about when you were at my office, we have nine regular office volunteers who come in every week on a schedule. They come on a schedule, and they do everything from our librarian. Todd was laughing because our librarian is a former ProLiteracy employee who was employed here as your librarian. And she's now our librarian. So she comes and she manages our lending library. And occasionally she may do a research project that I need done. We have our bookkeeper is a volunteer. A lot of our data entry, both donor data and student data and tutor data, volunteer data, is all input by volunteers. We do the literal envelope stuffing kind of volunteerism. And typically when we're doing that, we do a mail appeal 4 times a year. Our office, our operations manager will put out a call for help for the envelope stuffing to all of our volunteers. And we usually get a really good turnout and, have a room full of people stuffing envelopes and telling stories and having a good time and, and put that on Facebook when it happens. So that's an invaluable resource. I mean, the administrative work of running one of these, small to mid-sized local nonprofits, there's a lot of admin that you have to do, and no grant will pay you for that. People don't like their money going to pay for the bookkeeper, for example. Right. And so that's a great way, again, of leveraging resources to do what you need to do. They have to be supervised, but after a while, they get really good at those jobs. And again, a recurring group of people who've been coming for years in some cases to do these functions.
Exactly. One of the things we found when we started using administrative volunteers in the local literacy program I worked in, we had those folks call all of our tutors and get their monthly reports because we weren't getting a lot of reports in, but the tutors really valued that contact with our organization, that monthly contact, because these administrative volunteers, they would call, they would ask them, what have you been working on? Where have you been successful? What issues are you having? What resources do you need? And so those other folks that were out there doing our volunteer work and really carrying out our mission, all of a sudden they felt a much stronger connection to our organization. They felt supported much better, and it really led to a much better kind of persona in the community for our organization. It was rewarding for the administrative volunteers. It was also rewarding for the people out there doing instruction. So I think that thinking about those administrative volunteers and all the work that they can do to support your organization, that has a direct impact on the volunteers that are carrying out your kind of primary mission as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You're broadening your reach, and you're particularly in the instructional volunteers, those who have been doing that tutoring or testing or whatever, have a lot to offer. The new volunteers who you're putting into those instructional placements, it can be very intimidating, and those experienced folks often have wisdom that we don't even think about as staff or board members or what have you.
Right. Okay, so anything else you want to add for the group, or are we ready to open it up for questions, do you think?
I think we covered the waterfront here,
Okay.
So questions are great.
So we'll open it up for questions. I know there are folks online, and if you folks out in the audience have questions, we do have someone walking around with a microphone, so wait until the microphone gets in your hand before you ask the question. That way the folks online can hear the question as well.
I don't know, Todd, I'm a little nervous because Kevin Morgan has his hand up to ask a question.
So I just wanted to say, Marcia, we had a lot of people in the room that are in their 30s look at each other when you said their careers had peaked. So I just wanted to say, I think Marcia meant
at their peak.
I think Marcia meant your creativity was just beginning to peak. But I had a question. It's a two-part question. One of the things we've talked about at ProLiteracy, our national survey that you mentioned, Todd, shows a graying of our volunteers in the network. The part of that's driven by the fact that the baby boom population demographic is primarily in their 60s and beyond. But I was just wondering if there's been any strategy to recruit younger, and I mean by younger, under 50, but ideally in their 20s or 30s, volunteers. And then also, have you known any other nonprofits that have used volunteers online in a virtual environment? So perhaps they're not coming into the office, but they're doing your bookkeeping online, or they're helping you with donor recruitment online, something that wouldn't require them to come to you, but they could still spend time doing something for you.
So on the first question, I think a lot of the strategies that we've been talking about really are in part targeted at that younger volunteer who is under 50. And so a younger professional, for example, may be looking at coming onto one of our board committees and doing some work in that way, using their technical expertise as a resume builder. And then, later they can say, I did this particular thing for Literacy CNY, and it goes right on their resume. And that is also a strategy for recruiting board members, too, in your community. If you're trying to get some age diversity, you can bring on some board members who are younger and inexperienced at being on a board, which is an art form in and of itself, as long as the whole board isn't made up of people who've never been on a board before, because then you can get yourself into trouble. So some of these things, the event volunteers, I would say probably 40 of the 55 are under 50, and that they love that, that event volunteering. So, all these strategies we've been talking about really do address diversity of age and other kinds of diversity as well. On the second part of the question, it's interesting you said that, because our treasurer just said to me 3 weeks ago, I'm trying to find you some additional volunteer bookkeeping, and if you would consider letting that be done virtually, I can solve that problem a lot faster. And I sort of went, gulp, that our financial records virtually, how are we going to, and so you have to do a software upgrade, and you have to figure out, well, what's the procedure going to be? How do we have to modify our current bookkeeping and accounting procedures for that to happen? But it's exactly what you said, that there are people who would be willing to do that kind of function virtually, and we've never considered that before. I also have had some conversations with you and with others at ProLiteracy about an idea that we've kicked around forever, I think, about could we use technology to connect volunteers and students virtually, so that student who is working until 10 o'clock at night and isn't going to make it to class and isn't going to be able to meet with a volunteer one-to-one at the library in the middle of the day might be able to connect with someone in California or whatever. Or even could we do that in local communities? And I think given the way that technology has advanced, even just within the last 10 years, there are probably inexpensive ways to do that today that didn't exist when I was here at ProLiteracy and we were talking about that idea. So yeah, I think that's coming, Kevin. I think that's really a wave. The virtual volunteering opportunity is going to be more and more out there, and we need to begin to think about and explore those ideas.
Yeah, I would add a couple of things to that. I think some of the literature that I've read talks about younger folks. One of the things that they have a social value is wanting to spread around their volunteerism to a lot of different causes rather than being involved with one cause for a long period of time. So I think recognizing that is one of the reasons why it's important on us to diversify our volunteer opportunities so they're not all one-year commitments. And if you have those volunteer commitments that are shorter, like leading a conversation class for the summer or working on a fundraising event or something like that, then that's something that they can volunteer to do, go and do other volunteer opportunities, and then if it was enjoyable to them, you will find them coming back next year or a couple of years later, and so it gets put into their cycle of volunteer opportunities. So they wind up being not a year-long volunteer, but a very much a long-term volunteer with your organization. The online piece, it's funny, the literacy organization that I work with in St. Louis, a lot of times we are starting to run our own website and things like that, and we need graphics. My wife's cousin is a graphic designer, and she lives in Portland or out west, and so I often use her, and I think two things. One, I think a lot of those types of social media products getting people at a distance to work on your website, work on your Facebook page, your marketing thing, those sorts of things lend themselves to working online at a distance, but also that asking piece of kind of recognizing this is my family member, I'm going to ask them to volunteer. That's how people volunteer. If you want young people to volunteer with your organization, hire young people to be on your staff and then
Yeah, that's true.
have them go out and talk to their friends about your organization.
So I would say we have an interesting mix right now of baby boomers who are retired and have decided that for reasons of their own that they have a passion around literacy, and so they want to volunteer with us, and those younger kind of professionals who are looking to do something meaningful in the community and or looking to build their resume by practicing their professional skills. So it's kind of an interesting mix. The field is changing because those of us older baby boomers, well, it doesn't look gray, but it is gray-haired people. You know, a lot of us are retiring and the field is changing. And so I think we have to look at that issue of ageism, you know, through a very different lens in the coming years.
Great. Other questions?
Yeah, we have a few in the room, and then we have one that just came through online. Marcia, the IT Mid-Valley Literacy Center they were wondering if you could explain more about Scrabble Mania and just how it's structured.
We could spend an hour on just that. So I'll tell you what, watch the video, because you're going to have the link, and then shoot me an email, and I will set up a time and be happy to talk to you about it.
Sounds great, thanks. And then here's another one in the room.
Hi, I'm June Master Giovanni, and I work for ProLiteracy and Marcia at Literacy CNY. I'm a tutor. And my comment is about National Literacy Directory. And one of the things you can do is you can list your literacy program on it so people can find you.
Right.
But you can also, one of the options is to list that you're looking for volunteers.
Yes.
And not everybody checks that off. So if somebody is doing a search and they want to volunteer, your program might not pop up. So if you're part of National Literacy Directory, or if you want to join and go to nationalliteracydirectory.org, that's a really great thing to check off if you're in fact looking for volunteers.
That's good. And I can't remember if I did that or not, but I'll go check when I get back to the office. I did know that was possible. And the other thing is many communities, United Ways, have a volunteer bank where they will advertise your volunteer positions and even send people to you. And or other similar kinds of organizations, community foundations may be doing that as well. But yes, that's a great suggestion, June. Thank you. June is volunteering tonight at our event too.
Right. And I think I want to kind of add to the notion of communities using their United Ways, or a lot of times there's a volunteer center, or even some of the things like LinkedIn and those types of platforms. I know a lot of folks, when they are moving into a community, new to a community, looking for, and they're oriented towards volunteerism, before they know anyone in the community,
Yes.
that's where they go to look for volunteer opportunities. So it may not be a big recruiting tool, but it's a good recruiting tool especially for those folks that are new to the community. And then I think thinking through, what is it that person might want? They've picked your organization maybe because they like the mission, but also if that's a person that's new to the community, they're going to want to network with people, they're going to want to meet new people, establish some roots in the community. So making sure when you're listing volunteer opportunities on those types of sites that they're oriented towards the audience that might be using them.
Right.
All right, thank you. We have about 6 or 7 more minutes. Does anyone else have any questions, either online or in the audience?
Gosh, thanks. Like this. Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me okay? I'm just wondering, kind of piggyback off of what the gentleman in the back asked about volunteers. Have you ever thought to use like the retired and senior volunteer program, which is the built-in volunteer system where a lot of retired teachers go to and whatnot? I was just wondering if you went that route, because it is 55 and over.
Right. I have not. Again, we have an interesting dynamic in our program because our founder, Ruth Colvin, is here. And so I actually don't typically have to do broad-based volunteer recruitment. I've looked into the school district volunteer association, and that is a target that we will be approaching, I think, in the coming year for some volunteers. But yes, those are great suggestions. Any sort of, what's the name of I'm gonna be completely blank here. There's an organization that provides educational opportunities for retired people, and they do all kinds of things. They do trips and they do, no, I can't think of the name of it. It's broader than teachers. Oh, I'm gonna kick myself because I'm gonna remember it 5 minutes after we end. But anyway, it's a group of people, and they get together and they go to workshops and lectures. They take trips and they do all kinds of things, you know, all voluntary. I mean, it's all up to them at very minimal cost. And that's another kind of thing to look for, places where retirees may be going for entertainment or enrichment or continuous learning. Those are also kinds of places you might look to recruit volunteers.
I think your question actually brings up an interesting point. So I know, at least in the literacy field, as Kevin was saying, our volunteers are skewed towards older volunteers. And I think any organization wants to look at who their group of volunteers are and look at diversifying that pool of volunteers based on, you know, age, race, class, community, where you're from in the community, those things. But I think also we need to keep in mind, you know, not turning volunteers away is also good. So even though your volunteer community might be skewed towards older folks or younger folks or women or men, is if there's a nice pool of folks, even though you've got that group already covered, tap into that and maybe even use them in different ways than you are currently using your volunteers.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, if you give them a wide variety of volunteer opportunities, they will sort of gravitate to the thing that is most attractive to them, that they want to do. And, you know, part of the group of Scrabble-mania volunteers is a group of ladies who belong to a women's club here, and they come every year because they want to do registration. And so we don't really have a registration, but we have like a greeter hospitality volunteer, we call it, and they do that every year. You know, that's their thing. That's what they want to do. So the diversification, just like in fund development, the diversification of your volunteer opportunities that you offer is going to bring new resources into your agency.
Right, and that really goes to, I doubt very many organizations, literacy or otherwise, has on their list of volunteer opportunities registration. But knowing that a lot of those volunteer opportunities have, and really kind of going back, it also makes the point again that the way that you retain volunteers is to talk with them and understand what they're looking for. And so talking to these ladies and getting down to exactly what type of volunteer opportunity they're looking for, and then being able to meet that is what leads to them being both long-term volunteers and good ambassadors for your organization.
Thanks. And we have enough time. We have one more question online from the IT Mid-Valley Literacy Center again. And I think this question's for you again, Marcia. They would like to know, do you provide or require training for your administration and office volunteers?
So currently, most of them have been with us a long time, and they did not necessarily undergo the 15-hour training, or they came to us from ProLiteracy. They've retired, the ones I have. They retired and called me and said, do you have a volunteer opportunity? So they were very familiar with the field and the work. But we have talked about that in the future, if we were to find ourselves needing to recruit new office volunteers, we would ask them to go through our tutor training process to get that familiarity with the demographic group that we serve and the way we do our work and so forth. On the committees, you know, they're kind of the new volunteers on the committees. If they don't have a background in education, they're kind of getting their orientation and learning as they go. We do not require our board members or committee members to have undergone tutor training. They don't have to do that.
Alicia, I wanted to add to that if I've got time. There's also, I think, thinking about that issue, obviously training is a big issue for us, and I think it's probably a big issue for a lot of other organizations. But one of the things of looking at that team approach to delivery, a lot of times what that can allow you to do is do a much shorter kind of pre-service training for that individual, and then rely on the people that are experienced that you're partnering that new volunteer up with to provide some on-the-job training. Now, you need to talk with those experienced people and make sure they're covering the things that you need them to cover, and it's organized, but it allows you to shorten that training process and get folks into the field providing service a little bit quicker. So I think that allows us, at least literacy folks, to reimagine a little bit that 15-hour workshop.
Right.
That can also be a barrier for folks.
Absolutely.
I know we're running low on time. I just have one additional question, and it speaks a little bit to the retention issue. You talked a little bit about thanking your volunteers and how important that is. And I know a lot of literacy programs struggle with how often do I thank my volunteers? How do I acknowledge them? You know, does it need to be a monetary award? Can you give some ideas on what ways that you acknowledge those volunteers and how often?
Mm-hmm. So we do an annual reception that is intended to recognize all of the accomplishments of all of our volunteers every year, whether they come to the event or not. And so after the event, you know, we'll have pictures on Facebook, and you know, we typically do feature stories of various volunteers that will end up on Facebook or on our website or in our e-blasts that we're doing. And you want to kind of always put the emphasis on recognizing the contributions that way. And I try also to, at every public speaking opportunity that I have locally, you know, I talk about the long legacy of our organization in volunteerism and how volunteerism is at the heart of what we do. So, you know, I'm thanking the community for all those many years of people who have volunteered. At the same time, we don't do anything like pins or, you know, certificates for 5 years or 50, in our case, years of volunteering. And we don't do anything like that. And my impression is that people aren't really doing that kind of thing so much anymore in the field. That's a little bit yesterday. So I would say, you know, the public recognition using your social media, doing an event once a year to thank people or however often is appropriate for you, and then making sure in public venues like Scrabblemania, I always, you have heard me say this, thank our volunteers, all the ones who are there and all the ones who aren't there at that event, so that the community hears that too.
Yeah, and I think the thinking piece, the formal recognitions are really good, but even, you know, at your Scrabblemania fundraiser or whatever fundraiser you're having, just making sure there's a picture of the committee that put it together that you take and post to Facebook and say, great job, and name them all. Or it can even be as much as just bringing coffee and donuts to one of the planning meetings and saying, you know, thank you for your hard work. I know it's going to be a great event. You guys do a great job every year, and you know, here's some fuel to keep you going. It doesn't have to be formal. It doesn't have to be big. It just has to be thoughtful. And I think that's really what the key is.
If I could play off that for a minute, this thought crossed my mind a while ago, but we moved on. You know, we're so serious in adult education. You know, we're always talking about poverty and health, and, you know, it's all so serious. But volunteering needs to be fun, you know, for folks. So, again, to use our Scrabble Mania event, and this was a volunteer idea. It was a few years ago. I found that the entire of the 350 people who were there, 349 of them had a question that they needed to ask me personally, which meant that I could not manage the event and the celebrities and do all the stuff you have to do as the director, right? So I was complaining about this to a couple of my friends who are volunteers, and one of them said, "You need a tournament wrangler. You need tournament wranglers," right? And I went, "Oh." And he said, "And I'll do this. Let's set up a help desk." So we now have a help desk in the middle of the tournament room, the big banner that says, "Ask Me." And the two guys who are tournament wranglers wear 150-gallon foam hats that you cannot miss from bright green and bright blue, and, you know, and we make a big deal. The sheriffs do literally have bright green vests that say "Obey Me" on the back, and sheriff's badges. And the judges have ribbons that say "Judge." And, you know, this is all fun, cheap, not expensive, but fun stuff. And that's part of the notoriety of the event, I think, is all that fun stuff. In fact, real quick, because I know we're running out of time, we actually had a participant come up to Betsy, my operations manager, 2 years ago and said, "How much? I want one of those vests. How much? I want to wear it at home." So we sold her a vest for $20, you know. And Betsy always says, "We'll sell anything at that event for $20." So you know, have some fun with it. It needs to be fun.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right, well, it is 5 minutes past 4, so thanks everyone for staying. I know that Marcia has to run off to do an event to thank her volunteers, so I don't want her to be late to that, but anyone that's in the room, if you have any questions, I'm sure, you know, Marcia would be happy to share her contact information, and, you know, Todd maybe can stick around to answer questions. Anyone online, feel free to email, and we can connect you with Todd and Marcia to answer any remaining questions.